I think we'll go ahead and get started. So firstly, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to attend the webinar this morning. My name is Lenny Mansell. I'm the Director of Consulting Services at Encari, and as a special guest today, we have Wes Stewart, who's a Senior NERC Compliance Consultant at Encari. With that said, what we're going to be talking about today are some more specific technical aspects of what we're going to need to do differently when it comes to NERC version 5. And the subject matter areas that we're going to be covering today are configuration change management and active vulnerability assessments. So moving on to slide number 2, SIP 10-1 requirement 1.1. Basically, you've got to have a baseline. So, Wes, good morning. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Lenny.
All right. So baselines, and we've got to have a baseline. Are we talking the same kind of baselines we had with version 3, the ports and services and all that?
No. With version 3, the baseline that you're referring to is ports and services. No, with version 5, it's more encompassing. It's not as simple as ports and services. With version 5, we're really talking about the operating systems with version, a firmware version, the software packages intentionally installed, and the associated versions, obviously, of software packages, and then any custom software and security patches, and then, of course, along with any logical network accessible ports. And at a minimum, that's what we see as the baseline under version 5.
So these are all minimum things, baselines that we need to be tracking now.
That's correct. That's correct.
So these are like these would be kind of like columns in our spreadsheet, something to that effect.
Right. For every asset that you would have, these are the type of attributes that you would want to track as part of the configuration management program. That'd be in your tools that use, whether it be a spreadsheet, database, or whatever.
Okay. And it says that we can track these baselines individually or by group. Individually, I think, makes sense. What are we talking about with group?
Well, groups would be like devices, like functions. A clear example of that would be, say I had a primary and a backup ICCP server. If it's the same manufacturer and the application or the ICCP stack is the same, you could lump those together as like devices and manage them in that way.
So kind of like devices that are clones, the kind of thing that's built off of the same image or the exact same process and config, like twins, right?
Exactly.
And those will be the things that lend themselves well to grouping together. But like a group, if I tried to say, well, all of my Windows computers and my Cisco switches, that's not a good group, is it?
No, not at all. In a standard environment, there could be many functions for different server types, and so you would not want to group every Windows box in your group.
And I also guess with groups, maybe, you could say, I'm going to group together all the devices that I manage with SSH, and then talk about port 22, in that regard. Probably easier just to go by types of, like the role of the box, I would think now.
Right, yeah, the role would be the safest bet.
Also, we talk about here logical network accessible ports. They used to just say ports and services.
Right.
Could
And
you elaborate
now,
on that?
yeah, and now really it's just your standard, when we say logical network accessible ports, it's just the TCP, UDP ports, stuff like SSH, those sort of, the standard TCP and UDP ports.
Gotcha. All right, let's move on to slide number 3. Baselines, configuration management requirements 1.2 and 1.3. Have we documented and approve our changes and then update the baseline? So can we do the changes without, authorization? Do we need authorization for everything now in terms of a configuration change?
Yeah, you definitely need authorization to make a baseline configuration change. That goes without saying.
So for any of the elements that we're tracking in the baseline, if we find that a change is necessary there, then that's going to need to go through an authorization process.
Right, and to build on top of that, knowing what is expected to change from your baseline, so that you know what to expect. When you know what to expect, it's going to change your baseline. If there's any variances that are outside the scope of what's supposed to change, that's an automatic, alarm that potentially your baseline or your running config was not matching your previous baseline anyway.
Mm-hmm. And when we say document those changes, I guess to elaborate on what you said, that I guess we're really supposed to know exactly what is supposed to change, and we're supposed to write that down, with about each of the changes that we're going to do.
Right. For instance, if you realize that, by upgrading firmware, that your configuration is going to change by opening up an additional port or closing an additional port, you should know that going into it. And if anything else other than that happens, you know that there's an issue.
Yes. So any unexpected things for certain. What about changes in, like ladder logic or set points, things like that? Are those in scope for this?
No, in scope for configuration, monitoring, configuration management is not anything that would be ladder logic associated with PLCs, set points, those sort of things. We're not talking. That's not in scope for configuration management and configuration monitoring.
So it's just the things that were talked about at the elements of the baseline. So this is all about, like a new listening port or something like that.
Right, right.
I see Godzilla at the bottom of the slide here. He says you can't have any 6-month tickets, to try to avoid the 30-day requirement of updating your documentation. Is that probably good advice?
Yeah, I would definitely say that's good advice. That could be, deemed as kind of maybe gaming the requirement in a way. Since the requirement in and of itself is that if the baseline, the configuration baseline changes, that it should be updated in 30 days. So taking 6 months because your change management ticket has a 6-month window, I wouldn't. That could be seen as gaming the requirement or gaming the standard.
Yeah, really, the changes here, they have a start, like a beginning and an end to get the work done, and they're pretty close together, like an actual change. And then after you complete that, that's when upon the completion, that's when the 30-day timer starts.
Right, and and another point to build upon here on the subject is let's say that it was a 6-month window. Well, in more fluid environments, your configuration is going to change more than once within a 6-month environment. Being able to tie back to which configuration was in at the time that an associated change was made. So monitoring this at the interval that it suggests is going to make that easier.
Yeah. And you know what else? I would always recommend to, if you see there's a change in the baseline, go and get the actual baseline document, modify it, initiate the approval process, and don't call your work finished until the documentation gets updated. Don't think, okay, I'm going to close the ticket, and next week I'll go ahead and update that documentation. Even though NERC gives you 30 days, you might forget. And it'd be a lot better if, as a matter of course, the work's not done until the documentation gets updated.
Right.
All right. Let's move on to the next slide. So requirement 1.4, we need to determine which controls and then verify that the pre-controls settings are the same as the post-control settings. So you mean we've got to document which controls we think might be affected, and we have to do this prior to doing any changes? We have to write it down?
Right. Prior to implementing a change where your configuration is going to be modified, best practice to document which controls may change. The reasoning behind that is, what if your current running config, let's take a Cisco router as an example. The running config is supposed to match a baseline that you may have in a spreadsheet, a database, or whatever. But if it does not match that baseline, then your running config is not equal to the baseline. And so without documenting what you expect to change, you've just incorporated someone else's unapproved change to the configuration, in other words.
Right. Yeah, so if we're supposed to know what the change is, we need to be able to write it down first. And
exactly.
then this is asking us for those controls out of the baseline, if we expect any of those things to be affected in any way by this change, those are the things we need to articulate ahead of time before we do anything. All right. I guess the next parts are we need to verify that these controls came out the way that we expected with the pre and the post change.
Right, and that gets back to even what I was mentioning before. It gets back to saving your evidence. So if you're maintaining let's use the database example for Cisco routers. If you know what all your previous baselines were, then you know that you can compare your running config against your last known baseline to see if there's any discrepancies before you go in and make a change that's going to change the baseline again. So yes, you have to save your evidence.
I see. So if we check when we collect the data, the baseline data from the device before we make the change, we compare it to the baseline at that point. We compare the running config to what it's supposed to be, and that should match. And then we go ahead and apply our change. And then we collect the configs again and compare those to what it was before. If nothing has changed that we didn't expect, at that point, then we can prove by showing that side by side and saving that as the evidence.
Exactly.
Excellent. In the slide here, we have on the bullet under requirement 1.4.1 that says considering using a select all that apply kind of thing. I think what we're getting at there is, these elements, the minimum required elements of your baseline, those are known quantities. And those are the things that we need to be pointing out that, like, hey, this might get changed, or we expect this to maybe get changed. This could, possibly get changed. And if we set up what all those elements are in maybe a form or in our ticket system or what have you, so the person filling out the ticket, they can easily select this one, not that one, and this one. That's probably a good way to do it, instead of asking somebody to write down, okay, tell us all the elements that might change, all the elements of baseline. All right, let's move on to slide number 5. So still on baseline configuration change management. The other things that we've spoken about apply to high and medium impact BES cyber systems. And then this one applies to high impact only. And basically, we need to actually try out this change in a test environment, quote unquote, before we go ahead and roll it out to production.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. We're technically feasible for the high impact BES cyber systems. We do need to test config changes outside production. Obviously there's a technical feasible language, but it's always desirable to test outside the production environment for the high impact BES cyber system.
And so it says test environment there, and what if we don't have exactly a test environment?
Well, I've seen entities where they don't have the test environment, but it's a true replica where they can easily perform these tests, and they're forced to perform in production. And in that case, it's you perform it in a fashion that just minimizes adverse effects. For instance, if you have multiple changes that could affect your baseline at one time, don't do them at the same time. Do them one at a time. That's one of the easiest ways to potentially just decrease the amount of the adverse effects. Because if you're throwing in more than one change at a time, it's going to be harder to figure out which one actually causes the issue.
That's a really great point. So let me see if I can restate that. One very good way to minimize adverse effects is don't go doing 50 changes at the same time, like to a cyber asset. Do a whole bunch of different changes to that same cyber asset. Because if something goes wrong, it's unclear which one of those 50 changes, perhaps, is the thing that caused the problem. All right. So, and also if we're going to use a test environment, basically it needs to really sort of replicate production, and we need to kind of write down how it does, and then also how we deal with any aspects of it that maybe aren't exactly
right. And another thing to add there, Lenny, but then without trying to jump too far ahead, we see that concept again in our next topic of CVAs and the ability to conduct a CVA on a replicated test environment. But in either case, whether it's through a high-impact BES cyber system concerning configuration change management or a CVA, it is really on the onus of the entity to prove that that their test environment closely matches their production environment.
Okay. Let's move to the next slide, number 6. Requirement 2.1. This again is high impact only, but we need to monitor for changes. So I guess the question that that they're trying to get at here is, are any of my devices running unauthorized configs? Are there changes here I don't know about? And to prove it every 35 days. That sounds kind of challenging. What do they mean by changes to the baseline?
Well, you have your baseline you know about, but then you also have your running config. So it's proving that your running config is equal to your baseline configuration.
So you're making sure that what is actually running in reality does match the documentation of what it's supposed to be?
Exactly.
All right, I see. And so, that sounds kind of hard. What are some ways that somebody might accomplish that? Like, how do you monitor for such a thing?
Well, obviously there'd be some tools on the market that can do it for specific devices. But with that said, in these type of environments, we always want to do it with as minimal impact as possible. So it's not like we're looking to, somebody should be looking to scan in an environment. It's more optimal to, maybe use a script to log in and ask the polite questions of, such like NatSat or for listening ports or what is the current firmware version on a switch. So you log in, you ask those polite questions using scripts. It's one way that we typically see in the industry that minimizes adverse effects.
Yeah, I think one of the most important aspects of this consideration is that we're going to be doing this all the time. We're going to be doing this monthly. And basically, we need to make sure that there are no changes that are unexpected for all those baseline elements. So we're going to be doing this all the time. And it will really behoove us to figure out ways that are easy, ways to do this that are easy, and also that are repeatable. So how do we gather the data such that we can learn what the running config actually is right now, and then how do we perform a comparison, of that? Do we get the running config and save it to a PDF, and then get the baseline as a PDF, and then try to annotate those PDFs somehow? Or do we use a spreadsheet? And when they talk about evidence and these requirements, they say, like an application or a system or like a spreadsheet. That's really where the rubber begins to hit the road. There are, configuration management packages that can be deployed, commercial solutions, open source solutions, manual things. So in general, when we say an easy way, probably that's not doing screenshots or PDFs or something. Ideally, there's some kind of push-button way to safely gather that data and then perform the comparison of the before and after.
Right. And, and one thing I would also add there, Lenny, is that it also depends on the size of the entity. If you have, less than 10, in today's, terminology, CCAs, then you probably don't need the enterprise solution for configuration management.
Right.
You know, but with that being said, it needs to be, you know, consistent, automatable, and, you know, and be able to prove compliance.
Yeah. 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 A word from our data collection soapbox. You know, any methods you're going to use to collect your configuration data, you know, from your devices. I mean, this is a recurring theme with NERC-CIP. It's part of how you demonstrate that you're compliant. You measure what you have versus what it's supposed to be, and that's how you can prove it, that you're doing the right thing. But we're always striving for ways to do it that are repeatable, so it's the same output every time, no matter who does it, and that are sufficient so that the data we have just proves it, hands down. Like here's how I show you I did it. There it is. There's me doing it. And that's what I saved. Sufficient, safe, so that we're not knocking over DCS and SCADA servers and power plants and, you know, control centers, unplanned outages and all of that. We all know that, you know, we're trying to increase the reliability, not crash our systems. And then the fourth thing is that it should be easy. We'll touch more on those in a minute, but if anything you're doing is not like, you know, is not really trying to, is not as good as it can be on kind of those aspects, then maybe it's time for a better mousetrap. All right, let's move on to slide number 7. Did a little bit of foreshadowing here. This is talking about the action plan for, you know, what an entity ought to do to get themselves ready to be able to do all of these things we just talked about for version 5. So this is kind of high level, but develop a method to query all of your devices so you can measure yourself. It's like a speedometer in a car. It's illegal to drive your car without a functioning speedometer. The reason is you can't claim compliance with the speed limit if you simply don't know. And if you don't have a working speedometer, you simply don't know. So these methods for collecting this data that we're talking about represent a working speedometer. Wes? So once you're able to measure yourself for all the types of devices that you have, and you can do it at the drop of a hat, it's a repeatable process, whether we're talking about our Cisco switches or our checkpoint firewalls or our Ovation controllers or our Telnet RTUs, so on and so forth. Then we need to develop a good way to do our diff. It's kind of all about comparing the running config against what it's supposed to be. So if we developed a handy-dandy way of comparing that running config against the documented baseline of what it's supposed to be, those are the things that are going to help us. And if we have a tool to do the first part and a tool to do the second part, that's how we're going to get that maximization that we're talking about. You know, and when you're talking about comparing to baselines, you should always take your first measurement before you do anything and compare that to the baseline, and then do what you're going to do, and then do your after. In that way, you isolate that change. If you do those things and then take the comparison, the side by side, save that as your evidence, at that point you can say, you know, hey, I checked the settings and they equaled what they were supposed to be. And you know, I did a change and the things came out just like we expected. And some of the UDP ports changed, but that's exactly what we expected because that's how it works. Did you have anything that you'd like to add with?
No, you summed up that one quite well, Lenny. I mean, I was going to echo the same thing, that it was just about being able to measure yourself, the diff between the configurations, and then saving the evidence. So that's exactly what you were talking about.
Great. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Woodsy the Owl. He's been doing a lot of work with us in terms of spreading the word about industrial control system security, and kind of as a favor and doing our part as well. We've been talking about, pollution, and that, only you can, help to prevent pollution and clean up litter. And, Smokey the Bear, I think you saw from a little bit earlier. We actually contacted the publicist for Mr. Yuck, but he never did get back with us. But just a quick shout out to Woodsy there. So let's talk about vulnerability assessment under version 5. I understand a few things are a little bit different. Do we need to be doing our active tests every year, or is that in some other period?
No. That's one of the big changes in terms of vulnerability assessments with version 5. Your active vulnerability assessment, which is what you see normally in the financial arena or any other industry. It's your typical IT security-based vulnerability assessment. We'll be doing those every 36 months for high-impact cyber systems. And so for those, we're at a 36-month time frame. Your paper-based CVAs, which is what we're really used to today under version 3, those will continue on, but with the new inject of having to do the active CVA every 36 months.
All right. And whenever we add a new cyber asset to production,
exactly.
On that cyber
so
asset.
if you have if you're adding a new, I guess I go back to the old dependable. If I'm adding a new ICCP server inside my ESP, well, then I need to conduct an active CVA on that asset before it enters the ESP.
Right. All right, let's move to the next slide, number 9. So we've got the, kind of new terminology, a paper vulnerability assessment. Have we seen anything like this before?
Paper vulnerability assessment kind of alluded to that a minute ago. The paper vulnerability assessment is really more or less what's required today by version 3. Security configuration checks, the network ports and services identification, the stuff that we're used to already doing for version 3 that is not your typical CVA, where we're checking for default accounts and default passwords, default community strings.
And so, yeah, when they talk about vulnerability review here under the paper vulnerability assessment, saying, security rule sets and configurations. So I guess that would be, like our minimum password length and all of that would fall under there.
Yeah, and then also, to kind of even point back to our configuration management discussion a minute ago, a lot of this same information is going to be gathered based upon your configuration monitoring program. So while it may be a difference in reporting styles, a lot of your paper-based CVA, would be including a lot of the data that you're already be collecting based upon your configuration monitoring.
That's a really great point. You know, if we're already doing the right things in terms of knowing our config, monitoring it, knowing how it changes or hopefully how it doesn't change, we're gonna be able to knock this out rather easily by just conducting an actual review to show that we're doing a double check, save that double check or the results of it, and that's going to kind of you know, along with everything else in the basis section. I know that we're kind of summarizing here, but we should have all of this data already. They mentioned wireless review here, and they also mentioned under the active, but you know, a lot of environments have no Wi-Fi whatsoever in terms of their industrial control system. So what do we do if we don't have any of that?
Well, if it's not in use in any way for the bed, then, you know, then it's not in use. But at the same time, there's always it's never a bad idea to conduct essentially a check for that. Whether it's just you're not actually doing ward driving per se in your own building, but being able to conduct a review to ensure that there's no rogue access points and prove that in case it's ever asked.
Right, like maybe look at the inventory and verify that there are no, you know, wireless access points there, and probably from a policy perspective to say that, hey, during this paper vulnerability assessment, we're going to look for, I don't know, paper traces, if you will, of wireless access points, and if we find any, you know, we're going to treat them like this or that according to our policy.
Exactly, and it'd be very similar to how many entities today handle the no dialogue. You know, being able, as part of their physical assessment, they're looking for those type devices.
Great. All right, let's move on to slide number 10. Active vulnerability assessments. Talking about probes over the network and everything. What's the big difference here with the paper and the active?
Well, again, you know, paper we've already broke that down several times into really that is what we're doing today to a large degree, and the active vulnerability assessment, of course, is going to be more intrusive to the environment. It's not something that you're automatically going to just say, hey, let's install a Nessus server or a Nexpose server and start just scanning everything. It needs to be tested, tuned properly, so that you know that you are minimizing the risk before you conduct your first official active vulnerability assessment within a production environment. But then again, as we referred to earlier, there is the option to do this against a test environment. But again, with that said, the entity would, you know, they have to prove to some degree that their test environment closely matches production environment.
Okay. So let's spend a few moments and talk about some of the terms that we're looking at on this slide. So known vulnerabilities. Maybe it makes sense to just talk about like what that is, and since it's, you know, a little bit new to the NERC lands, could you expound on what is a known vulnerability? Does anybody are there any lists of these known vulnerabilities? By whom are they known?
Could you repeat that again for me, Lenny? I'm sorry, you kind of broke up on me.
I'm sorry. Could you expound a little bit about known vulnerabilities? What is a known vulnerability?
Well, a known vulnerability, something that's already been found in the wild. More than likely, we see that there's patches already released for, let's say, Microsoft patches. A lot of times for security issues, those are known vulnerabilities. Those are, would be the easy ones to fix simply by, patching your machine. So that would be what we're talking about in known vulnerabilities versus an unknown vulnerability.
Okay. So things that could be found in the CVE database,
Exactly.
and things like that. Kind of, version 123 of web server software ABC is susceptible to vulnerability XYZ. All right, so known vulnerabilities, those are the kind of things that these tools are looking for. Okay, your Microsoft web server is running an old version, and it's susceptible to remote attacks in this way. The second bullet here, talk about the number of probes that can happen when you're vulnerability scanning. That's a lot of probes there. Like 170,000 probes? How are we sending that many probes?
Well, when you're performing active vulnerability assessments, typically, let's think of a distributed network. You would want a distributed vulnerability assessment environment, and your console or your scanning machine is constantly it has a database of known vulnerabilities. After it fingerprints your machine, it's just going to start hammering. So that's one thing to keep in mind, not scanning across.
I brought up the drawing, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I see that now. When we're talking about the distributed vulnerability assessment diagram and the amount of probes that it throws out at a time, the concerns come in here by, am I filling up the state tables of my firewalls? Am I saturating my transport network? Those are big concerns for larger environments. Obviously, if you have one ESP, you have one vulnerability scanner, not going to be as big of an issue. There'll still be issues associated with, if the box was not configured properly, and you had tons of half-open connections, but that's a different subject. So when we're looking at the distributed vulnerability assessment in this diagram, typically you want to deploy a vulnerability scanner to each ESP. That way you're localizing the scans or the assessments on per scanner per ESP. And then typically you would have a console that would talk to each of those scanners.
I got you. So in a given ESP, we should have a port scanner or not a port scanner, but our vulnerability scanner there on each one of our ESP sort of segments to avoid going across firewalls, because with vulnerability scanning, we've got port scanning, and if you're going to do port scanning for compliance, you kind of need to scan all the ports. So that's 130-odd thousand port queries there for all the TCPs and the UDPs. And then all the plugins or different tests that your tool is going to do. Like, there are 45-odd thousand Nessus plugins, and Probably a good 30 or so thousand perhaps might apply to your environment. So sending all that traffic across your firewalls, that's not nice, especially port scans and firewalls. All right, let's go back. So it can be dangerous to do that many probes across your WAN connections. You might crash your firewalls. And one way that we can try to avoid problems with that is by determining specific configurations for our scanning software. We want to know exactly how it needs to be configured and exactly what configuration plays nice with our environment. And scanners are kind of configurable.
Right. It's one of these things you want to crawl before you walk, before you run. You don't, like we said earlier, you don't jump in there and start DOSing every system inside your ESP.
Yeah. So, all right, and as we usually say, you need to be very careful. Just, crawl, walk, run. Don't go learning to scan, or don't go trying a brand new scan config, on your production network. Before you're doing anything on your production network, you should basically know that it's not going to mess anything up based on the experience you've gained by testing it out in the production-like environment. And then cross your fingers. And in terms of this requirement, I think it's great from an information security perspective, and to do active vulnerability scanning. I've heard people say, oh, it's more like doing real security, in addition to all of the configuration control and everything, kind of like kind of suggesting that all of the existing version 3 NERC SIP are kind of like paper controls, and this is like real stuff. And it's some great stuff. And as an information security professional and consultant, definitely, we want to be doing this, but these systems can be so fragile, and it has to be, balanced. So I expect to see both entities that are both very successful in pulling this off, where they're not breaking their stuff, and I expect to see also instances where entities are less successful in the goal of not breaking any of their stuff. So, yeah, really good. So, moving on to the next slide, some more details about the active vulnerability assessment. It says we need to contain at least those elements. Could you speak to those elements a little bit, Wes?
Yeah, in terms of network discovery, what are some methods around network discovery? Obviously there's the ping sweep, ARP ping, passive monitoring. Passive monitoring is always a good one, putting in some taps and sitting there and capturing data and then parsing through it. That's always fun.
Like a network tap and a sniffer, you mean?
Right, exactly. ARP table monitoring. So if you're a scripting wizard, being able to pull all these things together and let's say gather the ARP tables from switches and be able to tell when assets are coming on or off the network. There's some products that are out there today that do that. So there's a lot of different ways of accomplishing that, but those are a few. Port and service identification. That's obviously, getting back to Nmap, everybody loves Nmap. If you're needing to, that's another tool that needs to be used in some environment. Test it first. Know how you're using it before you go into your ICS environment, your EMS environment, or start scanning a DCS. But if it's tuned properly, it can be, safe. So just to discover ports and services, and then of course, wireless scanning. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but everybody's familiar with the ward driving. It's essentially that, but within your office building. There's always, you can trace cables, but that's not going to show you everything. Being able to detect row access points. So there's tools out there to do that. Basically just get a laptop and start making your way through the hallways and trying to find the rogue wireless devices.
Yeah. Another thing that I think really bears mentioning with this slide, in the technical basis section of this requirement, responsible entities are strongly encouraged to seek guidance from NIST Special Publication 800-115. And that's the guidance on performing vulnerability testing. That is the same kind of guidance that I guess your one's typical corporate vulnerability test. What we've been saying, hey, this looks a lot different from SIP version 3 cyber vulnerability assessment. Really, the active vulnerability assessment that we're talking about here and the things that they're listing out really are kind of bare minimums. And in 800-115, it really discusses a full methodology about doing a very comprehensive vulnerability assessment in your entity. So we're seeing now where in the standards themselves, in the technical basis sections and things, we're being encouraged to look that up. That's a big deal. They're kind of telling us they want it to be some for real, regular old scanning, I guess, if you will. Just for lack of a better term. All right. Let's move to the next slide, number 12. We looked at this a second ago, but let's just touch base again here. Tell me about these scanning consoles. Like these are plugged into switches, and I should assume that all my other cyber assets, the computers and my controllers and so forth, those are plugged into the same switch.
Yeah, I mean, this is a simple overview of what one would see from a distributed vulnerability assessment environment. There's a lot of different vendors out there that offer that. It's not just, one Nessus server or what have you, but you have the console and then scanners that reside in different ESPs, different segments of the network. Different policies can be assigned to different scanners based upon the environment within that ESP. So there's flexibility there, but what the goal here, like how we talked about a minute ago, was be able to effectively scan the assets within each of your ESPs, but with minimizing the potential adverse effects that come with the increased traffic that we would put on, say, the firewalls, the transport network, so on and so forth.
Okay. So in this example architecture, then here in ESP number 1, we've got kind of the main server for our vulnerability scanning solution, the so-called console, and it also does scanning. So it does the actual scanning for things in ESP1. And then
Correct.
over in ESP2, we have more just like a scanning appliance. So it'll do all the heavy lifting and scan around all the devices inside ESP2 without making it go heavy over the network. And then it'll just report its results back to the console.
Right.
And sending the results is no big deal compared to scanning a bunch of stuff over the firewalls and the WAN and all of that.
Right. And then so obviously, it goes without saying, but the console is where you would define that scanning policy for each scanner that resides in each environment within each ESP.
Yeah. So just to close up on this slide, any of these remotes, any of these scanners, if there are 50 boxes inside ESP number 3, that scanner is going to be asking each one of those boxes 150,000 questions. So let's keep it local and not make all that go across our firewalls and our poor little T1s and everything else, so that they don't lose connectivity and want to crash or deny legitimate traffic. We're running a little bit close on time here. Let's take a look at some of the questions that were received. One of them is about, like, hey, if these tools are so dangerous, isn't this likely to decrease the actual reliability if we start using these?
Well, in truth, if it's done wrong, obviously, it's done wrong if it's not tested properly, if it's not tuned properly, then yeah, you'll have stuff that will be affected. You'll have assets that go down, applications that fail, but you should be, similar to what we said earlier, you should be testing and tuning whatever platform you'll be using for active vulnerability assessments before you get to the ICS environment or your SIP environment.
Yes. I would add to that, for SIP version 3, if we didn't have to port scan, we weren't going to try to port scan for all of these reasons about it being dangerous and trying to avoid unforeseen interactions that cause adverse effects. But now we've kind of got to do this stuff all the time. So even back in version 3, we said, like, you might have to do a little bit of port scanning. If you do, be careful, be very, very careful, crawl, walk, run, and all of that. I don't think that we can stress it enough now, because now we all pretty much have to use these tools that are very dangerous. And we all have to do a very dangerous thing now. That's the big kind of difference in my mind. We used to just try to avoid port scanning if we didn't have to, so that we would avoid doing something dangerous and not crash the power plant, right? But now, kind of, we all of our highs and medium impact cyber systems anyway, BS cyber systems, we've got to do this at least every 3 years. Or for our highs, our mediums, we can do it. One more question. For the configuration items that are specified as minimums for monitoring, would those be aspects we need to review as a part of a paper CVA? So the monitoring items, are those similar to the CVA?
Yeah, and we touched on that earlier, and basically, yes. There are some differences, but there are items that are required that we monitor as part of the configuration monitoring program that we put in that are also aspects to the paper CVA. So that's good, because essentially the old saying, you're killing two birds with one stone. Yeah, there's also the potential there to add some additional attributes to what you're monitoring for in your configuration monitoring program. Should you go ahead? It depends. It's a question the entity has to ask of themselves. But do we go ahead and monitor for passwords that have they're too old, or do we monitor for default community strings? And if you go ahead and put that into your configuration monitoring program, then you're essentially doing your pay-per-CVA almost in a near real-time basis, and with the difference being the reporting structure.
I see. Okay. So, just again, the very detailed configuration monitoring that we do, that ends up kind of helping us in a lot of other ways, doesn't it? All right. Wes, thank you so much for being a guest today. I'd like to thank everybody in our audience as well. I'd also like to solicit some input from our audience. We want to know what you want to hear about. We want to know what's on your mind. As you're charting a course and steering your ship towards SIP version 5, or if there's something else that you're dealing with, let us know. All of these submissions are, of course, kind of confidential. We're not going to say, hey, Bobby called us up because he's got these kind of problems. But we want things to be relevant and timely to the industry. And, we don't have a patent on a crystal ball that helps us know that. So we're asking for your help. And to the extent you give us your help, we can take that and run with it and bring things and bring information to the industry that is actually helpful. That is our purpose here. So with that, this is Lenny and Wes. We're going to be signing off here for Encari. We look forward to seeing you next month. Please drop us a line, webinars@encari.com, and let us know what you would like to hear about. Thank you very much, and good day.